I'm very happy to welcome Augusto Lopez-Claros, who is going to talk about equality for women, prosperity for all. So Augusto did his PhD at Duke University some years ago, around 81, I think. And is at the World Bank. You're on leave, but you're at the World Bank as a senior fellow at the Edmund Wall School of Foreign Service. You're also at that, at Georgetown University and at the World Bank. And you've been working a lot with the different global indicators at the World Bank, something that interests us very much here. Without indicators, it's hard to know what works and does not work. But you also written extensively on a wide range of topics, such as European economic integration, the determinants of competitiveness, reform issues in transition economies, and the European monetary system. That's a very interesting topic. And recently, you have published this book, Equality for Women, Prosperity for All, at St. Martin's Press. And that's what you're going to talk about today. So, very welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I want to tell you a little bit about the genesis of this research project and how this book came about, and then I want to spend most of the time today highlighting some of the more interesting insights and sort of conclusions, if you wish, that are embedded in the book. You know that. As was indicated, I was the director of the Global Indicators Group for about 6 years at the bank before I went on this sabbatical to Georgetown University. And one of the teams in the Indicators Group, which itself is one of the research teams within the research infrastructure of the World Bank, was actually compiling a very interesting data set on restrictions and discriminations that countries have embedded in their laws against women, right? If you go back a little bit in time, let's say 15, 20 years ago, at the World Bank and in other organizations that had an interest in gender issues like the OECD and so on, we had been learning that countries were actually using the law, meaning the Constitution, the Civil Code, the Family Law, the Tax Code, the Labor Code, Company Law, and embedding in these pieces of legislation, discriminations against women quite overtly. For instance, in some countries, the law would give the husband control of household assets. And this would actually prevent the women from using the property as collateral to gain access to the financial system to get a loan, unless she had the blessing and the authorization of her husband, which again is always a question, maybe yes, maybe not. We had learned that in some countries, the law imposed certain restrictions on women's mobility. She needed authorization from her husband to travel, to get a passport, to open up a bank account. We knew that many countries had imposed job restrictions on women. There were particular occupations that she was not allowed to take up, or there were restrictions on the hours in the day where she could work and so on. So we had this kind of anecdotal evidence, from a number of countries in the world, which sort of led us to think, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could actually collect this data on a systematic way for a large number of countries, so that we could actually get a sense of, how serious is the problem, right? So we have the anecdotes, but how big is it? Is it sporadic and occasional here and there and so on? Or is it more sustained and more comprehensive? And so thus began a project where we essentially, for a large number of countries, we did it in stages, initially 143 countries, then 173 countries, and the latest report, which was issued in 2018, is 190 countries, essentially the entire World Bank membership, other than, I think, Cuba and one other country. And Cuba is not a member. And so we gather all the pieces of legislation that we can think of, and I have mentioned a few, from the Constitution to the Tax Code and the Labor Code, we translated these laws where translation was not available in English, so from Chinese, from Arabic, from French, from Spanish. So you can imagine it was a huge undertaking involving literally thousands and thousands of hours of work. And then once we had translated these laws, then what we did is we asked ourselves a whole series of questions for which we then sought the answers in the law. Right? So, for instance, does the constitution of the country in question have a clause that includes gender as a protected category? Yes or no? An easy question, all right? Does can a woman in a country open up a business in the same way that a man can? Or does she actually go through more bureaucratic hoops? Does it take more procedures for her to open up a business? Can she open up a bank account in the same way as a man can? Can she travel abroad without seeking permission from her father or her husband or some guardian? Does the tax code confer tax benefits to men that it doesn't confer to women? Does the country have domestic legislation protecting women from violence? Let's see, what else? Well, I think you begin to get the idea. I gave you 6, 7 examples. So we posed something like 44 such questions for which we sought the answers in the law. And eventually out of this came a huge data set, which, for instance, allowed us to say in Iran, the law contains 27 restrictions against women that overtly discriminate against her in some fashion, right? Now, I admit Iran, together with Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and a few countries in that part of the world, in the Arab part of the world, are some of the worst countries. And there are others, that are at the other end of the spectrum with a lot less restrictions. The point is that we were able to gather this huge database, which then we could analyze. Not only that, since we had the number of restrictions per country, then we could begin to do correlation analysis. We could see, are these the number of restrictions? Is it correlated, with some other interesting variables, right? So, for instance, we discovered that the higher number of restrictions, the lower the labor force participation rate of women. This was very clearly in the data, and I'll show you a chart later on that actually shows this correlation. Yeah? We discovered that the higher the number of restrictions, the bigger the wage gap between men and women. That the higher the number of restrictions, and this one was an interesting one, the lower the school enrollment rate of girls at the secondary level relative to boys. So 13-year-old girls in these countries with a very large number of restrictions were actually being discouraged already by the system, from even finishing school, right? They probably were asking themselves, what's the point? Mom has an education and she's not working. Right? The higher the number of restrictions, the lower the number of women-owned businesses, and so on. I'll just give you a few examples. So essentially, the book came out of a kind of a desire on Bahiyyih Nakhjavani, who is a French novelist, and I'll tell you why I teamed up with a novelist to do this work. But essentially what we wanted to do is we wanted to take the database and sort of examine the ramifications and the implications. What is the meaning of gender inequality? What are the consequences for society of having, an extensive gender inequality throughout the world? But before I get there, let me highlight perhaps, some of the more interesting insights that come from the data set, which we then talk about in the book, and we illustrate and give you examples, and then, examine sort of the broader implications. The first thing that was really quite sobering from the data is that among all the countries that we collected the data for, and I'm talking about thousands and thousands of data points, imagine, 190 countries and 44 data points for each country. The first thing that sort of was a bit of a shock to us was that there are only 18 countries in the world where there are no discriminations embedded in the law against women. Right? In other words, 90% of the countries have 1, 2, 3, 27, 15, 18, 29 in the case of Saudi Arabia, that we were able to identify. And actually, let me make a parenthesis here. It is a very powerful data set. And as you can imagine, some of the countries didn't particularly like that we were publishing this data, right? So without going into the details, I would be summoned by the representative of a particular country in a particular part of the world, sitting on the executive board of the World Bank, who would then come and tell me, why are you doing this? And it was interesting, but they never questioned the accuracy of the data, because the data was simply based on a reading of the law, right? So if the minister said the civil code doesn't say that, we could actually take out the civil code and point out to Article 1167 where it actually does say that, right? And so pretty quickly it became clear that that kind of argument was not going to be very fruitful, right? But so 18 countries that do not overtly discriminate against women. And one of the interesting observations is that you would think that all of these were high-income countries, right? Because many people argue, and you see this argument in the literature, that gender equality is something that eventually comes, with development. That as countries become more prosperous, as the population becomes educated, like your country, Sweden, then eventually people realize, gender equality makes no sense. It's bad economics, right? And so we'll make sure that the law does not discriminate against women. And in fact, this is only partly true. In that 18 countries set, there were, New Zealand was there, the Netherlands was there, Canada was there, but so was Peru, and so was the Dominican Republic, and so was Armenia, which are not particularly high-income countries. And among the countries that have restrictions, we had many high-income countries. So that was the first interesting thing, that in fact you don't have to wait 200 years until everybody has got the income per capita of Sweden to actually begin to treat your women, fairly, at least in terms of the law, right? So that was the first thing. Related to that is the whole question of does the absence of legal restrictions and discriminations against women in the law necessarily imply that there is no gender gap in the country? And the answer to that question is definitely no, right? Spain is among those countries, without restrictions in the law. And yet if you ask yourself, are women in Spain fully politically empowered? And the answer to that question is really not at all. Is the participation of women in the corporate boards of publicly listed Spanish companies, very high? No, not at all. It's incredibly low. Do women in Spain suffer from domestic violence? Yes, it's a national epidemic. Domestic violence in Spain is a very serious problem. Thousands of women get killed every year by their husbands, their partners, their boyfriends, and so on, right? So even Spain, which has no legal restrictions, has a long way to go in terms of achieving full gender equality and the empowerment of women and so on and so forth. So that's something that I wanted to clarify at the outset. It is one of the limitations of the data set. Let me sort of pick up maybe 2, 3 sort of interesting sort of insights that come from the data and that we explore at length in the book. We in the book we don't feel constrained by the data. We explore and I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Right. The first issue pertains, and I'll pick them up in random. I had actually made myself a list of some of the things that I wanted to talk about, but I'll pick them up as they come to my mind. I'm not going to cover every conceivable idea and chapter that is included in the book. I'll limit myself to half a dozen observations. One that is quite interesting and very sobering is the whole question of domestic violence and violence against women. We have a chapter in the book called "The Virus of Violence," which by the people who reviewed the book was one of the most talked about books, because we get a lot into the data and economic estimates of the cost of violence and the implications of violence and where it comes from. But at the bank, we had collected data on such things as, does legislation exist even, that protects women from violence? And what we discovered is that if you go back to 1990, which is not so long ago, right? 1990 is, after the end of the Cold War. It turns out that I think there were only 4 countries in the world that had legislation protecting women from domestic violence. Today, there are about 127, all right? So there has been sort of a very rapid increase. And I have a chart here which you can look at, which just shows basically the progression over time beginning in 1990, and you can see a very nicely ascending slope. And that means 2 things, that there are about 60 or so countries where this legislation doesn't exist. But more importantly, what we were able to do looking at the data is to ask ourselves, does the existence of this kind of legislation make any difference in terms of protecting women? Right? Because, the fact that the law exists doesn't necessarily mean that the law achieves its intended end, right? And what we were able to see is that the average life expectancy of women in those countries that don't have the legislation is actually lower than in those countries that have the legislation. I mean, it's very noticeable. Women live longer where the legislation has been put in place. And so this then raised that kind of another interesting question, which is, if we can actually do before and after analysis, right? If we have a large number of countries for which we have the date when the law has been introduced, and therefore we can compare mortality before the law is introduced and after the law is introduced, can we come up with an estimate of the actual number of premature fatalities associated with the absence of domestic legislation in these countries? And at the moment, we actually, together with a couple of colleagues, we have a paper before a journal. It's being refereed and reviewed and so on. My hope is that it will see the light of day, in the next year or so. But essentially, this paper makes the claim that, yes, you can estimate, and that the number of premature fatalities, the premature mortality, is actually in the millions, right, over the last 40 years. And it kind of gives new meaning to this term, which sometimes has been used in the media and by feminists about the war on women, right? And people raise their eyebrows and they say, war on women, what are we talking about? We have made great progress in gender equality in the last several decades, in many parts of the world. Can you meaningfully talk about a war on women? And the answer to that question appears to be yes, because if you're talking about millions of women who have died prematurely because of domestic violence across the planet, then it's a legitimate expression. So that's one sort of interesting insight. Incidentally, we look at the kinds of protections that the law introduces, and there's a great deal of work to be done. You can derive some satisfaction from the fact that the number of countries has increased. Let me quickly jump to that chart because I think it shows in a nice way. I will skip around a bit if you don't mind. I don't like to be a slave to PowerPoint. This is number of countries with domestic legislation. You see, you can see that back in 1990 there were only 4 in the world. And one interesting question is, what has actually led to this sort of increase, between 1990 and 2014? I think the latest data is 127. And here there's a kind of an interesting insight that we were able to see that when countries assumes certain obligations, especially in the context of UN treaties and so on, such as CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of all Forms of Discrimination Against Women, for instance. We were able to see that within a 5-year period after the adoption of this convention, you see, for instance, a reduction in the number of restrictions embedded in the law, right? So they make a difference. Countries do take these obligations seriously. Some don't, but many do, and on average, it shows, right? And this I had referred to before. This is the number of restrictions embedded in the law. These are some of the variables that I mentioned. So, for instance, female employment as percent of the population, the labor force participation rate, and as you can see, the data very clearly shows that the higher the number of restrictions, the lower the labor force participation rate of women relative to men. So this must be Saudi Arabia, this must be Iran, just by what I remember about the data. So that was one interesting set of conclusions. The other one, which I wanted to mention, which we get very much into the book. The book, by the way, and you may like this or not, but we take a very clear, very unambiguous position on the issue of quotas. We are pro-quotas. Quotas for the participation of women in parliaments, quotas for the participation of women on corporate boards, and so on. And we go into the arguments. I think we make a good case. Okay. Now you can read the book, and you can disagree with us, but we have had by now arguments on these issues, and we feel pretty confident that we are on the winning side of these arguments. All right, but let me elaborate a little bit. When studies are done on gender, the variable that most often people focus on when they want to talk about political empowerment of women is actually the percent of women who participate in parliament. Right? It's a good. We have good data. I'll show you. I think I have it somewhere in here. Yeah, here you have. From a high in Rwanda of 61.3%, which is one of the, I think, only 2 countries where you actually have more women parliamentarians than men. Down here's Sweden at 46, and then you have, the sort of the great emerging powers of the world, Russia with 15.8, you have India with 11.8, let's see what else. China is not, it's higher actually, it's 24.9. Hungary, 12%, and so on. We have data on what the Interparliamentary Union compiles this data. And so, because some countries have introduced quotas and others haven't, then again, for an economist, allows you to do comparisons. It's like an experiment. Have the quotas made any difference in terms of objective data, objective criteria? And here there are sort of 2 or 3 very interesting insights. The first one that becomes very visible very quickly is that the labor force participation rate of women in those countries that have parliamentary quotas is higher than in those countries that don't have the quotas, right? So other things being equal, the introduction of the quota seems to have a very salutary effect in terms of encouraging women to join the labor force. Maybe the example of having all these ladies, sitting on parliamentary committees, being on television, and obviously actively participating in the political process, encourages women to join the labor force or to get an education, get training, get skills, and go out into the labor market. And so that's a positive, because obviously the higher the labor force participation rate of women, the better for the economy. So that's the first thing. But actually there's more. India is a very interesting case. I was actually in India in November making a presentation. I had gone on to give a number of presentations and speeches, and one of those actually was an invitation from one of the leading organizations working on gender issues, one of the think tanks, a little bit like yours, but you're not focused on gender, but they were, or they are, and they invited me to make a presentation of the book, and so I I pointed out to them something obviously they knew, which is that India doesn't have a quota, which is the reason why, at the Indian parliament, the participation of women is so low, right? But in the 1990s, India is a federal state. In the 1990s, the Indian government passed a law which gave the states the ability, if they so wanted, to introduce a 1/3 quota for the participation of women in village councils, right? India is very much not only a federal state, but it's also a rural country. The majority of the population lives in rural areas. And the village has this, smallest political entity called the village council, and they were overwhelmingly male-dominated in the whole country, up until the time when this law was introduced. And when the law was introduced, what happened is that some of the states adopted it and some didn't. Right? So that was an interesting experiment. And so what colleagues of mine at the bank were able to do many years ago is actually go and do surveys initially to assess what was the attitude, towards the introduction of the quota for the village council, and then to go back, many years later, like 10 years later, and ask the question, well, did the quotas make any difference? And the results were really quite fascinating, and there are two that I want to highlight, although there are more, but these two I think are the more salient ones. The first one has to do with the structure of spending decisions by the village council, over time. If you compare the councils with 1/3 women and the councils without any quotas, where the majority remain, overwhelmingly male-dominated, the structure of spending is very different. In the councils where women are present, you have a lot more spending on education. You have a lot more spending on public health, on water projects, on the kinds of infrastructures that are actually supportive of the quality of life in the community. Contrary to the other councils where you see more spending on sports facilities, celebrations, other kinds of things. So that was very visible. You could really tell the presence of women in the village councils does lead to an improvement in the quality of life within the community, because the structure of spending is more supportive of community life. The one that I found more interesting even, perhaps, was that whereas in the early stages the attitude of men to the introduction of the quota was very hostile and very skeptical, and they were saying this is unfair, and because remember, there was no prior history of women participating in village council. So one attitude was that, well, what are these women going to say? What expertise do they have? They cook, they help us with the fields, but all of a sudden, we're going to put them in the councils, or we're going to force them to make political decisions about resource allocation and so on. So there was a great deal of skepticism and hostility. 10 years later, you go back to many of these villages and you ask, well, what do you think? And many of the men have actually shifted their attitudes. They are much more tolerant. They are actually voting in many cases for the women, because they have seen that it turns out that you don't need a PhD to serve on a village council, number one. Number two, these women somehow managed to catch on and to come up to speed, and the men 10 years later are much less resistant to the idea of the quotas, which involves a kind of a change in mentality, right? Which is really tremendously important when you want to address deeply ingrained prejudices on the issue of gender. Right? So that was very encouraging. I know that in this part of the world, quotas for the participation of women in corporate boards are somewhat controversial. The Norwegians have it. As far as I know, you guys here in Sweden don't, right? You've decided not to. We take a fairly firm view on this one as well. Perhaps not quite as strong as the issue of the parliament, because in parliament, you're talking about political empowerment. You're talking about major decisions that affect legislation and that affect many aspects of the life of the country and its policies. But we also have looked at the evidence on corporate boards, and we we are on the whole, really very much in favor of it. There was a survey done last year, actually a bit longer, maybe 2-3 years ago in England, 6,500 companies. And the researchers split the sample. These are publicly listed companies. So they split the sample between companies that have 3 or more women directors on the board and companies that have less than 3 or 0. And one of the conclusions that comes out of this study is that the companies that have higher participation of women are much less prone to corporate governance scandals, to negative publicity associated with bribery, corruption. Shall I give you other examples? Siemens bribing officials in developing countries. Companies that shall remain unnamed, cheating the regulators on emissions of data, and so on and so forth, right? So it does make a difference. And then you can look at other indicators as well. The evidence suggests increasingly that actually having women participation on boards is actually good for the management on the companies and the performance of the companies. We get a lot into in the book, because it adds a bit of spice to the argument, trying to debunk some of the arguments against, quotas, against the empowerment of women via these mechanisms, and we're quite open in terms of the arguments that we put forward, and I'd be happy to go into some of those arguments, but I don't want to sort of dwell on this too much. Let me. As we were writing the book, we decided to add another chapter because we just felt very strongly that as rich as the data was that we were tapping into, to tell a story about gender inequality, that there was a kind of a cultural dimension to gender inequality that we needed to address, right? And the reason we went into this discussion, of culture and religion in particular, asking the question, is there a kind of a religious root to gender inequality? I was reminded of something that happened in the 1990s, which I think illustrated in a very interesting way, the kind of arguments that sometimes are brought forward, on this issue of culture and the role of culture in gender. In the 1990s, the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, if you will remember, and there was a resolution issued by none other than the United Nations Security Council. We actually quote the resolution in a footnote somewhere in there. It was 93, 94, I can't remember, condemning the Taliban for what they were doing to women in Afghanistan. The population of Afghanistan in the 1990s was 22 million people, so there were 11 million women who were actually being harassed. The girls weren't going to school, so you had a generation of women who were growing up illiterate. There were women doctors in Afghanistan that had worked before the Taliban came to power that now were no longer able to work. They were sitting at home doing nothing, deeply frustrated because there was a great deal of need in the country because women could not work and so on, right? And so, this was well known. It was publicized. The media was full of articles of abuse against women. Thousands of cases of women being thrown acid in their faces because they were troublesome, because they wanted to work, because they were unhappy and with their husbands, their boyfriends, whatever. And so, when the United Nations condemned in this very strongly worded resolution the Taliban came up with an interesting argument, and they said, this is our culture. This is who we are, and you should respect our culture. You should not try to impose your values, your Western values of gender equality on us, right? And we thought that, this is a singularly dishonest kind of argument, right? Because what is this argument based on? It is actually based on the appropriation by the men to speak on behalf of Afghan society, on behalf of everybody, right? Nobody had done a survey of the 11 million women in Afghanistan asking them, hey, would you like to send your girls to school? Would you actually have like to have the right to work and to join the labor force? Nobody, raised that question, right? So it was essentially the men deciding on their own to speak on behalf of everybody, right? And so we think that when this happens, it is dishonest and senseless to talk about, cultural exceptionalism and to say this is our culture, right? And in fact, it's interesting, but there was a UN rapporteur who looked at the issue of domestic violence in Afghanistan, and that was very much one of her conclusions. But let me raise one more issue. When we put together the data set at the bank on restrictions, the data was kind of very sobering, and I don't mind saying actually slightly depressing, right? Because you just all of a sudden realize how persistent, how pervasive this is, and it's not just the Arab countries, where there's a kind of a long-established tradition of restraining women and sort of putting legal restrictions on their mobility and so on and so forth. In fact, before I raise the final concluding question, let me give you another example. A couple of years ago, I was in Moscow, and at the end of my visit, I had a meeting with the senior economy minister. He is a very senior official who's actually in charge of all the economic ministries. He has, in addition to the rank of minister, he's actually a deputy prime minister. And so in the meetings that we had, we had been discussing the whole question of investment climate in Russia. Russia at the moment is a country that is under sanctions. If you actually look at the data, the Russian economy between, I'm trying to remember the numbers, roughly between 2000 and 2009 grew, 2008 grew at an average rate of 7% per year, real terms, all right? So it was, they were growing very quickly. Post global financial crisis, 2008, between 2009 and 2016, the average growth rate of the Russian economy is 0.7%. So there has been a tenfold decline in the pace of economic growth. And this is partly, the collapse of oil prices after the global financial crisis. Russia is very dependent on energy, as you know. But it is also, sanctions, and so, the government has been trying to, pose the question, what are some of the things that we can do to actually make the investment climate a bit more friendly for the private sector, so as to create a kind of a stronger foundation for economic growth. And so at the end of the meeting, I'm asked, what else can we do in Russia to improve the environment for the private sector? And so since we had already been discussing, many of the things, and the question was, what else, right? In addition to the things that we've already talked about, which I will not go into, is there anything else that we can do? At which point I said, well, Minister, in the Russian legislation, there are 456 occupations in the Russian Federation that are forbidden to women. And he looks at me very surprised, right? And he says, give me an example. Because he doesn't quite believe, what is this number coming from? 456 job prohibitions? And I said, well, Minister, you know very well in Russia, women cannot drive the metro. You go to any metro station, and when you see the cars coming, they're always driven by men, right? And so he readily concedes, because he knows that, everybody knows that, right? And he doesn't ask me for a second example, because I think he has realized all of a sudden that if necessary, I have 455 other examples which I can give, right? So we don't go that way. So he says, well, this is a legacy of the Soviet Union. And of course, I'm too polite to tell him, that the Soviet Union ceased to exist 25 years before, right? And there is no reason why the laws should still have these restrictions embedded, discriminating against women. And so he goes on to the second line of defense, which is, well, many of these restrictions have been introduced to protect women, right? And you tell me, how are women being protected by not being allowed to drive the metro? Right. So very safe, their safety records are excellent. It's an extremely well-functioning system. It's actually a pride of Russian infrastructure. The metro system is excellent. I can attest for that. I lived in Moscow for 4.5 years. I don't think I ever saw a car break down. You never run to catch the metro, as many people do in other parts of the world, because within 60 seconds there is another one coming, right? So it's pointless to try to get in before the doors close. Just wait a minute, another one will come, right? So it's a tribute to them, right? But women cannot drive it, and there are many hundreds of occupations, especially in the energy sector, which happen to be very highly paid. So the country has this huge wage gap, right? And so one question that we look at in the data and in the book is, what are the implications of these restrictions on the whole question of not gender inequality, but income inequality, which is a big issue these days, right? The data on income inequality in the world is very perturbing. The trends are all in the wrong direction. And it will not surprise you to discover that these restrictions worsen income inequality because you are discriminating against half of the population, right? So in fact, there are these very toxic relationships between gender inequality and income inequality, which are making income inequality worse. Now, why is it taking so long to deal with the question of gender inequality, right? Why is it that well into the 21st century we look at the law and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of restrictions all over the world, right? Sometimes in the most unlikely places, Chile, which is a country that is otherwise an extremely well-managed economy, it's a member of the OECD, when we look at the data, has several restrictions. It's actually one of the worst performers in Latin America. It's one of the countries that discriminates the most against its women. Surprising, all right? There's an interesting story there as well, but we won't go into that. All right, so in thinking about the reasons why it's taking so long, I can think of at least 2 or 3 that come immediately to mind. One of them obviously has to do with the law itself, right? That is evident. The reason why it's taking so long for the economic empowerment of women is because the law is discriminating against her, and it's curtailing her opportunities to join the labor force, to do all the kinds of things which you can do when you have a legal framework that is transparent and open and unbiased. The other one, of course, has to do, I think, with lack of education and opportunities. There's this wonderful English writer of a couple of 100 years ago, Mary Wollstonecraft, and in 1792, a little more than 200 years ago, she wrote a book called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is really a wonderful essay. And when you read it, what is amazing is that it is to place yourself historically and to say, this is not being written 10 years ago, it was written 200 years ago, right? And Mary, as she sometimes is known because people have difficulties with her full last name, which is a bit of a mouthful, she was making the argument at that time, which was picked up by John Stuart Mill and then Amartya Sen much later and so on, essentially saying, look, the reason why women appear to be less intelligent, less capable than men has nothing to do with intrinsic differences between men and women. It has everything to do with the fact that she's not being educated and she's not being given the opportunities that men are receiving, right? How many female professors were there at Cambridge and Oxford in 1792? 0, right? People mistook that as evidence that women were less intelligent, right? Well, when I was going to Cambridge University, my supervisor was Elizabeth Thompson, who was the youngest fellow of King's College in the history of the university, and she was in her late 20s. And she was a brilliant mathematician and somebody who, when I met with her for my weekly hour of supervision, she dazzled me with her intelligence. I don't think in the entire period that I was there, I was able to ask a question, no matter how difficult, I was studying mathematics at the time, that she was not able to answer, quite clearly, very quickly, within whatever, 10, 15 minutes, or sometimes 30 seconds, right? So why is it that Elizabeth Thompson became the youngest fellow of King's College? Because by then, by the time I was a student there, women had been given the opportunities for education, and they were able to show what Mary in 1792 had herself already recognized, which is that the absence of women in high positions of academia and politics and so on is because she's not being given the opportunities. So that's one aspect, And I mention this because you might say, well, but women are now being educated everywhere and school enrollment rates are even higher in some countries and so on and so forth. Yes, true, but we still have a long way to go, especially in terms of the quality of education which is being given. We have an entire chapter in the book on education, and it's really very sobering because we have a huge way to go in that. And let me give you a shocking little bit of news from the Associated Press. This is not 1792. This is 2018, August 10 to be precise, all right? And the headline says, a Tokyo medical school released an internal investigation earlier this week that confirmed media reports that it had altered entrance exam scores to limit the number of female students. Did you hear that? Were you aware of that? All right, so the Tokyo Medical School was basically cooking up the data and artificially reducing the scores of women so as to limit the percentage of women who were admitted to medical school, right? So here is the spirit, the soul of Mary Wollstonecraft, pointing her finger and saying, you see, this is the reason why, gender discrimination continues and remains, a very, very difficult social problem. But the other and the final point I wanted to make has to do with kind of misallocation of resources. When I was in Moscow in the 1990s, I was there representing the IMF. One of my first jobs was basically working as a young economist in the International Monetary Fund in Washington, and the last big thing I did for them was I was posted to Moscow in the early 1990s during the sort of Russia's transition to a market economy. And so one of the things that was very visible to me immediately there was essentially the extent to which the economic decision making was entirely in the hands of men, right? The people that we negotiated with, programs, on the other side, were always men, with their own particular priorities, right? I remember one particular discussion where we were making the case to the government of introducing, unemployment protection schemes, because this was a very difficult period. The Soviet economies had an elephantine military-industrial complex, which essentially was collapsing. The end of the Cold War brought about the collapse of the military-industrial complex, and so you had these factories that were shedding labor, by the hundreds of thousands. Unemployment was going sky high, and there was really not very much in the way of protections. And so we were making the case that why don't we help you? We have access to world-class expertise to design some kind of unemployment compensation scheme. It won't help you next month, but over the longer term it is going to make a difference in terms of providing a safety net, and it will also be politically important, because then these people, if they are protected, they will not become deeply disappointed with the transition and then turn against the government. And I also remember, the total lack of interest. The authorities were more interested in safeguarding the tax exemptions of Gazprom and the cronies and the oligarchs than in doing the kind of social protection that was actually absolutely essential to sustain the transition, right? So we live in a world in which a lot of the decisions are made by men when it comes to resource allocation. Overwhelmingly, you can collect the data, we have the data, overwhelmingly. Budget committees in parliaments, finance ministers, heads of central bank, governors of central banks, overwhelmingly are men. The data is really quite shocking. Where women are ministers, they tend to be Minister of Health, Minister of Culture, Minister of Education, but not in the big ministries like finance and the central bank. And so what we argue in the book is that this has very clear implications in terms of priorities for spending and in terms of what gets done. And so let me give you one example. The IMF did a study in 2015 calculating the budgetary cost of energy subsidies. Countries all over the world are subsidizing gasoline consumption, carbon, electricity. What's the other one? Natural gas. Right? So there are 4 big ticket items. And the value of these subsidies on an annual basis is $5.3 trillion, right? Which is about 6.5% of world GNP. Right? So it's huge, it's astronomical. Right? And you might say, well, but okay, so governments waste a lot of money, so here's one more example. But no, it's not so easy, right? Because 2 things. First, when you actually look at who are the beneficiaries of these subsidies, typical example, right? India. India spends anywhere between $40 and $50 billion per year on its budget, subsidizing energy. And the data suggests that 60% of the benefits of the subsidies go to the 20% top of the income distribution, right? Because just ask yourself, who gets this subsidy from gasoline in India or in dozens of other countries? Is it the poor, illiterate women in Indian villages? No, because they don't buy gasoline. Who buys gasoline? The car-owning middle classes in Delhi and in Mumbai and some of the other urban centers, right? So intuitively, you immediately get this, right? And the IMF has calculated this very much. I repeat, I had a chart here, but it's gone. 60% of the subsidy goes to the 20% top of the income distribution. So these subsidies are making income distribution worse, right? At a time when all of us are worried about the social, the economic, and the political implications of warped income distribution. Secondly, the IMF estimates that if overnight we could somehow miraculously eliminate all of these energy subsidies, global emissions or carbon warming gases would drop by 20%. So they would have a measurable impact on climate change, right? So these subsidies are making income distribution worse, they're making climate change worse. They're accelerating climate change, right? So as a public policy, it's idiotic. Who has cooked up these public policies in the world? It's the men who've done it, I assure you, by and large, overwhelmingly, right? And so this, in a country like India in particular, you might say, well, what is the opportunity cost of $40-50 billion per year on an annual basis? Well, let's think. According to the World Bank, there are close to 800 million people in the world living on less than $1.90 per day. That's the extreme poverty measure, which is a very, very austere poverty line. You don't want to live on $1.90 per person per day, right? You live on the edge, right? On the edge of survival. The latest data on malnourishment, on malnutrition, actually shows an increase. It used to be that there was a little less than 800 million malnourished children in the world. Today, the latest data coming from the Food and Agriculture Organization says that the number has risen to 815 million people, right? And then just it so happens that there are about 800 or so million illiterate people in the world, many of them, like close to 300 million of them, in India. and 2/3 of them are women, right? So here you have kind of this very interesting comparison, right? The country is spending vast sums of money subsidizing energy, and it is a country that at the same time has, upwards of somewhere between 200 and 300 million illiterate people, 2/3 of which are women, right? So I ask you, is that a wise allocation of resources? No, I don't think so. It is very perverse. And it comes back to my question, why is it taking so long? Well, it's taking so long to empower women economically because there is this dimension of misallocation of resources. And that's just the energy subsidy. I could give you a few other examples where we are wasting huge resources on a global scale that could, if they were redirected to education, to especially of young women, girls, and so on, would make a dramatic difference in terms of accelerating, the integration of women into the labor force, the acquisition of labor, other kinds of opportunities and rights. Let me finish sharing with you. I wanted to show you the slide, but short of that, I have a quote that I want to share with you. In the book, we say, look, traditionally there has been an attempt to frame the debate of gender inequality from a human rights perspective, right? And the argument is a very valid one. People say, look, gender inequality is a violation of women's rights. It is a violation of the Universal Declaration, which has been signed by most countries in the world, including Iran, and others in the sort of Middle East and North Africa region. It goes against the UN Charter, which 193 countries in the world have endorsed as part of their membership in the United Nations, and the UN Charter very firmly identifies gender equality as a right. So there is that dimension, and in fact we do have a chapter in the book where we look at the history of the kind of a human rights history of gender inequality, and the very interesting, very sort of anecdotes and examples, some of them funny, some of them very, 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 very sad. But in the book, we very much focus on the economic dimension, which I hope I have persuaded you is there. Gender inequality is bad economics. It is bad for productivity. It's bad for competitiveness. It's an idiotic policy. We pay a heavy price for gender inequality in economic terms. But we also get in the book a little bit into the security dimension, and we make the case that we have also paid a heavy price for the absence of women from political decision making. You were at the Peace Forum, right? We attended the Paris Peace Forum last November, and I don't know whether you remember, but at the very beginning of the first day of the forum, Angela Merkel gave a talk. Macron and Angela Merkel spoke back to back, and I think it was Merkel. I hope I'm not wrong, but if it wasn't Merkel, it was Macron, all right? But I think it was Merkel, who mentioned a book written by this English historian, Christopher Clark. And the title of the book is called The Sleepwalkers. And it is about World War I. And the reason Chancellor Merkel mentioned the book is because this was an event where we were commemorating the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And so the point that she was making, which is the point that Clark makes, is that World War I was an idiotic war. And you might say, well, are there wars that are not idiotic? And then, you can get into the debate, well, maybe the Second World War was worth fighting, right? Because the alternative was to have a world dominated by Nazis and Hitler, and nobody wanted that, right? So, many people who were pacifists in World War I, like Bertrand Russell, thought that World War II was worth fighting because the alternative was just too dire to contemplate, right? But World War I, the historians seem to be agreed, was a war that we sleepwalked into. It was a war that was completely preventable. It was a war that was fought, for no particular geopolitical advantage, and as a result of which 17 million people died, right? And so, after the forum, I got the book, right? And I did a little experiment because the book is very rich and it's got an index and then you can very quickly make a list of the 100 people, who were most involved in the declaration of the war and in the execution of the war, right? You could say that the 100 top policymakers, both on the American side, on the European side, and so on, who were involved in the war. And guess what? All 100 of them are men, of course, right? This is 1914 after all, right? Not even in the United States women have the vote. That would come several years later. Right, so in 1914, women are out of it. Their voices don't count. In the book, we make the case that we have paid a very heavy price for that, right? And this quote is very much in that spirit. And this is a talk given by in 1912 in Philadelphia, so more than 100 years ago. And the head of the Baha'i community is traveling in America at that time, giving talks at Stanford University, in scientific societies, in churches, in synagogues, in a whole range of places. And in Philadelphia, he says the following. He says, equality between men and women is conducive to the abolition of warfare for the reason that women will never be willing to sanction it. Mothers will not give their sons as sacrifices upon the battlefield after 20 years of anxiety and loving devotion in rearing them from infancy, no matter what cause they are called upon to defend. There is no doubt that when women obtain equality of rights, war will cease entirely among mankind. Powerful words. We align ourselves with that thought, and we develop that in the book. All right, I'm past the 40-minute deadline. Wow, way past it. It happens to me often. People have pointed out to me that during the last 20 minutes of my presentations, and say 3 or 4 times, and to conclude, right? And I never seem to conclude, but now I have concluded. Thank you.